The massive starship Celestial Horizon drifted silently through the inky blackness of deep space, its sleek titanium hull reflecting pinpricks of distant starlight. Lieutenant Sung Park drummed her fingers nervously against the holographic control panel. Her eyes locked on the alien vessel approaching from the starboard side. "Incoming transmission," whispered Yunji, her fingers dancing across the communication console. The bridge crew tensed, knowing this wasn't just another routine diplomatic encounter. The Chiron were notorious for their unpredictable nature, species that had rejected over 212 previous contact attempts by different galactic civilizations. Sung adjusted her navy blue uniform, feeling the subtle weight of her communication translator embedded behind her right ear. She had trained for this moment her entire career, a breakthrough first contact mission that could potentially reshape human-alien relations forever. The Chiron ship was unlike anything humans had ever encountered. It wasn't a traditional spacecraft, but more like a living crystalline structure that seemed to breathe and pulse with an internal energy. Geometric patterns shifted across its surface, creating mesmerizing light displays that could easily disorient an unprepared observer. "They're scanning us," muttered Park Jae-sung, the ship's primary defense specialist. His hand hovered dangerously close to the weapon systems, ready to activate defensive protocols at a moment's notice. The tension was thick enough to cut with a plasma knife. Suddenly, a holographic representation materialized in the center of the bridge. The Chiron representative wasn't humanoid. Instead, it appeared as a swirling collection of translucent energy patterns that constantly reshaped themselves. When it spoke, the sound wasn't heard but directly transmitted into each crew member's mind. "Humans." The communication felt more like a complex mathematical equation than language. "Your request for cultural exchange has been considered." Sung suppressed a smile. In diplomatic circles, a Chiron consideration was rare and potentially groundbreaking. Their species was known for absolute isolation, rejecting almost all forms of external communication. The ship's internal systems began to react strangely. Holographic displays flickered, temperature controls wavered, and for a brief moment everyone felt a strange tingling sensation, as if something was probing their collective consciousness. Yunji's communication console erupted with a burst of complex data streams. Symbols and patterns that defied traditional linguistic interpretation began scrolling at incredible speeds. She realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct neural data transfer that no human had ever experienced before. "They're testing us," Sung whispered, her training kicking in. Every movement, every reaction could determine the success or failure of this historic moment. One wrong gesture could mean instant termination of negotiations. The crystalline alien vessel began to pulse with an extraordinary rhythm. Its external structure seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in patterns that suggested a form of living technology far beyond human comprehension. Sensors across the celestial horizon went wild, recording data that would take xenobiologists decades to analyze. Park Jae-sung's defense systems remained on high alert. His fingers never left the emergency protocol triggers, watching the alien. A vessel like a predator ready to strike. Years of military training had prepared him for first contact scenarios, but nothing could have prepared him for the Chiron. Sung understood this was more than a diplomatic mission. This was humanity's chance to prove they were worthy of galactic recognition. The Chiron were known to assess species not through traditional communication, but through some inexplicable quantum-level interaction that scientists were still struggling to understand. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to resonate through the ship. It wasn't sound in the traditional sense, but a vibrational frequency that seemed to penetrate every molecular structure. The crew felt it in their bones, in their neural pathways, a communication method so advanced it bordered on mystical. The holographic representation of the Chiron representative began to shift, creating intricate geometric patterns that seemed to dance with mathematical precision. Each pattern told a story, conveyed an emotion, transmitted a complex series of intentions that human language could never capture. "Prepare for potential neural interface," Sung commanded, her voice steady and calm. Her crew knew exactly what to do, activate neural dampeners, maintain psychological equilibrium, and be ready for anything. As the two vessels hung in the infinite darkness of space, humanity held its collective breath. This moment would be remembered forever, the day everything changed. End of Part 1. The diplomatic chamber aboard the Celestial Horizon hummed with an electric anticipation. Soft blue ambient. Lighting illuminated the circular room, designed specifically for cross-species interactions. Lieutenant Sung Park knew this moment could define humanity's future in galactic diplomacy. Yunji carefully placed a small, seemingly ancient audio device on the central holographic platform. It was her grandfather's vintage music player, AI, relic from Earth that somehow felt more meaningful than any advanced alien technology. The device looked almost comically primitive next to the sophisticated Kyren communication interfaces. As the first notes of Yoruma's River Flows in You began to play, something extraordinary happened. The Kyren representative, a being named Era, stopped moving entirely. Her crystalline form, which had been constantly shifting and pulsing, became absolutely still. The music was unlike anything the Kyren had ever experienced. It wasn't just sound, it was a complex emotional landscape that transported listeners through invisible emotional corridors. Each note seemed to carry memories, feelings, entire universes of human experience. Era's neural receptors began to react in ways her species had never encountered. The mathematical precision of her consciousness started to crack, like delicate glass being touched by an unexpected warmth. Human music operated on a frequency that defied their logical communication systems. Park Jae-sung watched the monitors, his hand still hovering near emergency protocols. The ship's sensors were going crazy, recording data that would take decades to comprehend. Strange quantum interactions were happening between the music and Era's molecular structure. The melody continued, soft piano notes dancing through the diplomatic chamber. Invisible waves of emotion began radiating from the small device. Waves that penetrated the Kyren's typically impenetrable psychological barriers. It was like watching a fortress being dismantled by something as gentle as a breeze. Era's crystalline form started to shimmer, changing colors in response to the music. Blues merged into purples, then soft greens, each color representing an emotional response previously unknown to her species. The crew watched in absolute silence, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented. Yunji realized the music was more than just sound. It was a form of communication so advanced that it transcended traditional linguistic barriers. Each note carried complex emotional information, telling stories that words could never capture. The Kyren communication protocols began to malfunction. Their entire communication system, built on cold mathematical precision, was being overwhelmed by something fundamentally human, raw, unfiltered emotional expression. Suddenly, something impossible happened. Moisture began forming around Era's crystalline structure, the first signs of what humans would recognize as tears. For a species that had never experienced emotional vulnerability, this was revolutionary. The ship's AI began generating complex algorithmic representations of the music's impact. Graphs, mathematical models, and quantum interaction charts filled secondary screens, each one telling a story of how human artistic expression could break through the most sophisticated psychological barriers. Park Jae-sung whispered, "What is happening?" His military training hadn't prepared him for a scenario where music could potentially rewrite an entire species' communication paradigm. Sung Park remained calm, her eyes fixed on Era. She understood intuitively that this wasn't just a diplomatic encounter. This was a moment of potential cosmic significance. Humanity was proving that its greatest strength wasn't technological superiority, but its capacity for emotional complexity. The music continued, Yoruma's composition flowing like a living entity through the diplomatic chamber. It was transforming the Kyren representative at a fundamental level, revealing emotional landscapes that had been hidden for millennia. Era's form began to pulse in synchronization with the music's rhythm. Her crystalline structure was no longer just receiving. It was responding, dancing, communicating in a language far more profound than any verbal or telepathic communication. The crew watched, breathless. They were witnessing a first contact scenario that would be studied for generations. A simple piece of human music was doing what centuries of diplomatic negotiations could never achieve, creating genuine, unfiltered connection. As the final notes of the composition faded, something had fundamentally changed. The universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. End of Part 2. The diplomatic chamber transformed into a landscape of raw, unfiltered emotion. Era's crystalline form trembled, her entire molecular structure experiencing something unprecedented, genuine, unrestrained feeling. Yunji watched in disbelief as the Chiron representative began to change. What had started as a simple musical experiment was now rewriting the fundamental understanding of alien consciousness. The ship's advanced sensors were working overtime, capturing every microscopic transformation. "Systems are going crazy," muttered Park Jae-sung, his fingers dancing across multiple holographic displays. Strange quantum signatures were erupting from Era's body, patterns that defied every known scientific model of communication and emotional response. The music continued to pulse through the chamber, each note like a surgical instrument carefully dismantling centuries of emotional suppression. Era's crystalline structure began to vibrate with an intensity that suggested internal conflict. Centuries of logical programming battling against the raw power of human artistic expression. Suddenly, something extraordinary happened. Tears, actual, liquid tears, began forming around Era's neural receptors. For a species that had never experienced emotional vulnerability, this was nothing short of a biological revolution. The crew watched in stunned silence, understanding they were witnessing a moment that would redefine interspecies communication. Lieutenant Sung Park remained calm, her training kicking in. She recognized this wasn't just a diplomatic incident, this was a fundamental breakthrough in understanding consciousness itself. The human capacity for emotional complexity was proving to be more powerful than any technological advancement. The ship's AI began generating complex visualization models. Intricate holographic representations showed how the music was literally rewiring Era's neural pathways. Waves of emotional energy danced across the displays, revealing a language more complex than any verbal or mathematical communication. Era's body began to pulse with colors humans had never seen before. Soft blues merged into deep purples, then explosive greens, each color representing an emotional landscape that had been locked away for millennia. It was like watching a flower bloom for the very first time, except the flower was an entire species' emotional potential. Park Jae-sung's defense systems remained on high alert, but something had fundamentally changed. The threat of conflict seemed to dissolve, replaced by a sense of profound connection that transcended traditional understanding of communication. "The music," Yunji whispered. "It's not just sound, it's a complete emotional language." Quantum sensors began detecting something unprecedented. The music was creating harmonic resonances that matched the fundamental vibrational frequencies of Era's molecular structure. It was as if the composition was speaking directly to her cellular consciousness, bypassing all logical barriers. Era's form started to shimmer, her crystalline structure becoming more fluid, more organic. The rigid mathematical precision that had defined her species was melting away, replaced by something far more dynamic and alive. The diplomatic chamber felt different, charged with an energy that suggested something miraculous was happening. Humanity was proving that its greatest strength wasn't technological superiority, but its capacity for emotional depth and artistic expression. Memories seemed to flow from the music, fragments of human experience that Era had never encountered. Moments of love, pain, joy, and loss danced through her consciousness. Each note was a story, each melody a universe of emotion that her species had never imagined possible. Park Jae-sung's monitoring systems went into overdrive. Quantum entanglement. Readings suggested that the music was creating a direct neural bridge between human and Chiron consciousness. It was more than communication. It was a form of empathetic connection that defied traditional scientific understanding. Lieutenant Sung Park took a careful step forward. She understood instinctively that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment that would be studied for generations. The simple act of playing music was dismantling psychological barriers that had existed for millennia. Era's crystalline form began to resonate with the music's rhythm. Her entire being was transforming, becoming something neither human nor Chiron, a new form of consciousness that emerged from genuine emotional connection. The universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. End of part 3. The Chiron Central Communication Hub erupted into chaos. Thousands of crystalline communication nodes began experiencing unprecedented system failures, triggered by the quantum emotional resonance transmitted through Era's transformed consciousness. High-ranking Chiron administrators watched in horror as their meticulously constructed communication network started to disintegrate. What had been a perfectly organized system of mathematical precision was now experiencing something they had never anticipated: genuine emotional unpredictability. "Transmission compromised," shouted a senior communication specialist, his neural interfaces flickering with unstable quantum signatures. Holographic displays across the central hub showed multiple system breakdowns, each representing a different communication node infected by the human musical transmission. The music, that simple, seemingly innocent composition, had become a weapon more powerful than any technological assault. It penetrated the Chiron's advanced communication networks like a living virus, replacing cold calculations with raw emotional complexity. Quantum communication barriers that had existed for millennia began to crack. Each musical note acted like a precise surgical instrument, dismantling generations of emotional suppression. The Chiron leadership watched in growing panic as their most fundamental communication protocols were being rewritten. "This is impossible," muttered the primary communication director, her crystalline form vibrating with unprecedented uncertainty. The human music had done what centuries of technological advancement could not: introduce genuine emotional variability into their perfectly structured system. Across different communication nodes, Chiron representatives began experiencing spontaneous emotional responses. Mathematical calculations were suddenly interrupted by unexpected feelings of joy, sadness, and curiosity. Their entire species communication model was collapsing in real time. The central hub's emergency protocols initiated multiple containment attempts. Sophisticated quantum firewalls were deployed, attempting to block the emotional transmission. But each defensive mechanism failed spectacularly, overwhelmed by the music's complex emotional frequencies. Park Jae-sung monitored the situation from the celestial horizon, his advanced tracking systems capturing every microscopic change in the Chiron communication network. What was happening wasn't just a communication breakdown, it was a fundamental transformation of an entire species' consciousness. Yoonji's communication interfaces began receiving fragmented transmissions from the Chiron hub, emotional data streams mixed with complex mathematical equations, creating a new form of communication that defied traditional understanding. Each transmission suggested a species in the midst of a profound evolutionary moment. The Chiron leadership. Emergency Council convened in a state of complete panic. Their perfectly structured society was experiencing something they had no framework to understand. The human music had introduced a variable that their entire civilization was unprepared to process. Quantum sensors detected something extraordinary. The emotional transmission was spreading like a living network, jumping between communication nodes with unprecedented speed. It wasn't just affecting individual Chiron, it was transforming their entire collective consciousness. Lieutenant Sung Park understood the magnitude of what was happening. Humanity had accidentally discovered a communication method more powerful than any technological weapon: the ability to connect through pure, unfiltered emotional expression, the Masway. Chiron Communication Hub's central processing unit began generating strange new algorithmic patterns. Mathematical calculations were now being interrupted by emotional variables, creating a hybrid form of communication that was neither human nor Chiron. Emergency containment protocols failed repeatedly. Each attempt to block the emotional transmission only seemed to accelerate its spread. The music had become a living entity, transforming the Chiron's communication infrastructure from within. Holographic displays across the communication hub showed a stunning visualization of the transformation. Rigid geometric patterns dissolved, replaced by fluid dynamic energy signatures that suggested a profound evolutionary leap. Park Jae-sung whispered to Yoon-ji, "We're watching a species being reborn." The universe seemed to pause, holding its breath as an entire civilization underwent a transformation triggered by a simple human musical composition. What had begun as a diplomatic encounter was now revealing itself as something far more significant, a moment of cosmic revelation. The Chiron leadership realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Their perfectly structured civilization was experiencing its first genuine emotional awakening. End of Part 4. The galactic transmission networks buzzed with unprecedented activity. What had started as a simple musical encounter had transformed into a civilization-altering event that would be remembered for generations. Era stood at the center of the Chiron Cultural Transformation Council, her crystalline form now pulsing, with a complexity that defied her species' previous understanding of consciousness. Around her, hundreds of Chiron representatives watched in a mixture of fear and fascination. "Music is not just sound," Era proclaimed, her voice resonating with newfound emotional depth. "It is a living communication system that transcends technological barriers." The Celestial Horizons crew watched the live transmission, understanding they had accidentally sparked a revolution that would reshape galactic diplomacy. Lieutenant Sung Park felt a profound sense of responsibility. Humanity's artistic expression had become a bridge between civilizations. Quantum communication networks began adapting to the new emotional frequencies. Where mathematical precision once ruled, now complex emotional landscapes emerged. The Chiron were learning to feel, to experience, to understand existence beyond cold calculation. Research centers across the Chiron homeworld began intensive studies of human musical compositions. Each piece became a gateway to understanding, emotional complexity. Classical symphonies, jazz improvisations, and contemporary musical forms were analyzed with unprecedented intensity. Park Jae-sung monitored the transformation, his defense systems now serving a different purpose. They were tracking the most significant cultural shift in Chiron history, a peaceful revolution triggered by artistic expression. Yoon-ji discovered something extraordinary. The music was creating new neural pathways in the Chiron consciousness, allowing them to experience empathy, creativity, and emotional depth for the first time. It was like watching a species learn to see color after millennia of experiencing only black and white. The Chiron Cultural Council established a new diplomatic protocol. Every communication would now include an emotional resonance component inspired by human musical techniques. Mathematical precision would be balanced with emotional understanding, a revolutionary concept for their civilization. Quantum researchers discovered that human music operated on frequencies that could literally restructure neural networks. Each composition was more than an artistic expression. It was a complex communication system that could bridge seemingly impossible psychological barriers. Era became a symbol of this transformation. She traveled across Chiron territories, sharing her experience and introducing the concept of emotional vulnerability. Her journey was documented and studied, becoming a turning point in their species' evolutionary understanding. The Celestial Horizon was invited to become a permanent cultural ambassador. Lieutenant Sung Park understood this was more than a diplomatic mission. It was an opportunity to demonstrate humanity's unique capacity for emotional complexity. Galactic communication networks began adapting. Other alien civilizations watched the Chiron transformation with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Humanity had accidentally discovered a communication method more powerful than any technological weapon, pure emotional expression. Research institutions across multiple star systems began studying the phenomenon. How could a simple musical composition trigger such a profound transformation? The answer lay in humanity's unique ability to communicate through artistic expression. The Chiron began developing new communication technologies inspired by human musical principles. Quantum communication devices now included emotional resonance modules, allowing for a more holistic form of interaction. Yoonji's grandfather's vintage music player became a historical artifact. The simple device that had started this revolution was now preserved in the Chiron National Museum, a symbol of how art could transcend technological and biological barriers. Park Jae-sung's defense systems were repurposed. Instead of tracking potential threats, they now monitored the spread of emotional communication techniques. The military was transforming into a cultural exchange platform. Lieutenant Sung Park reflected on the incredible journey. Humanity had proven that its greatest strength wasn't technological superiority, but its capacity for emotional depth and artistic expression. The Chiron Cultural Transformation Council made a historic declaration. Music would now be considered a fundamental form of communication equal to mathematical and technological interactions. Era stood before the council, her crystalline form now a complex tapestry of emotional and mathematical signatures. "We are no longer just calculators," she proclaimed. "We are now beings capable of feeling, of understanding, of connecting." The universe seemed to pause, recognizing that something extraordinary had happened. A simple human musical composition had sparked a revolution that would reshape galactic understanding of consciousness itself. Humanity had accidentally discovered its most powerful diplomatic tool, the ability to connect through pure, unfiltered emotional expression. End of part 5.